Dropping a tray of coffee on the head of the most dangerous man in Montreal was, statistically speaking, not a great way to start a Monday. It wasn't even supposed to be Colette Tremblay's tray. She was covering for Josie, who had texted at 6:47 a.m. claiming food poisoning, but whose Instagram story at 6:52 a.m. showed a mimosa and a sunrise. The tray was too heavy. The heels Colette had borrowed from her roommate were too narrow. The marble floor of the Auberge Saint Laurent's private dining room was, as it turned out, freshly polished to something approaching a skating rink. The physics were not in her favor. She felt her left ankle roll first. Then the tray tilted, and a small silver pot of dark roast, freshly brewed, aggressively hot, launched itself off the tray with a kind of precise, targeted energy that Colette herself had never once managed to apply to anything in her 26 years of living. It landed directly on the left shoulder of the man sitting alone at table 7. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Colette stood frozen, one hand still outstretched where the tray had been, staring at the spreading dark stain blooming across what she would later learn was a $4,000 charcoal wool blazer. The man didn't move. Didn't make a sound. Just sat very, very still in the way that certain animals go, still before they do something irreversible. She had seen his photo exactly once, 3 weeks ago, in a newspaper Josie had left on the kitchen table. The headline had been something about a Port Authority investigation. The photo had been grainy, taken from a distance. The kind of photo where the subject clearly knew the camera was there and had decided, with complete confidence, that it didn't matter. His name was Rémi Fontaine. He was 41 years old. He ran an import logistics company called Group Fontaine that operated out of a glass tower in Old Montreal and had, according to the newspaper, absolutely nothing to do with the movement of stolen medical equipment through the port of Montreal. The journalist who wrote the piece had been very careful about that. Rémi Fontaine's lawyers were apparently very thorough people. He turned his head slowly and looked at her. He had dark eyes, the kind that registered information without broadcasting reaction, and a jaw that looked like it had been assembled with structural intent. The coffee was still dripping off his sleeve. He said nothing. "Oh," Colette said. "Oh no." She grabbed the cloth napkin off the nearest place setting and lunged toward him, which was the wrong instinct, because the heel that had already betrayed her once slid again on the polished floor, and she lurched forward, grabbed the edge of the table to stop herself, and sent the small vase of white tulips skidding directly into his water glass. Water, flowers, broken glass all over the table. The two men, who had been standing at opposite ends of the room, men in dark suits with a particular stillness of people who were paid specifically to be still, had both moved forward at exactly the same moment. They stopped when Rémi raised one hand. A small gesture, barely a movement at all. They stopped like someone had cut their power. "I'm so sorry," Colette said, her voice embarrassingly high. "I am so incredibly sorry. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I know it won't cover it, obviously. I can see that I'll figure it out. I can do a payment plan. Is your arm burned? Can I get you ice? Or a towel? I have a towel. I had a tray. I dropped the tray. Obviously, you know that you were there." She stopped herself. Rémi Fontaine looked at her for a long moment. "What's your name?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Colette Tremblay. I'm so sorry. I'm covering for someone." "Colette?" He said it the way people say a word they're deciding whether or not to keep. "Sit down." Sorry. Pull up a chair and sit down before you destroy something else." She sat. He reached over with unhurried calm and plucked a surviving piece of toast from the breadbasket, which had miraculously avoided the disaster zone, and resumed reading the papers he'd been reviewing when the coffee hit him. He did not call the manager. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at her again for several minutes, during which Colette sat very upright in the chair she'd pulled to the corner of the table and tried extremely hard not to exist too loudly. "You said you're covering for someone," he said finally without looking up. "Yes. Josie. She's sick." A pause. "She's not sick. She's at brunch." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. adjacent to one. The auberge's private dining manager, he said, has been recommending a new catering contract to my company for 4 months. He tells me his staff are exceptional. He looked up then. Are you exceptional, Colette Tremblay? She looked at the spreading coffee stain on his $4,000 blazer. I type 85 words a minute, she said, and I have never once lost a reservation booking. I'm a very good server when the floors aren't polished like this. He studied her for another moment. Then he turned back to his papers. Tell the manager I'd like to see him. She stood up carefully, walked very deliberately toward the door, made it approximately 8 steps before her borrowed heel caught the edge of the carpet runner, and she stumbled, grabbed the door frame, recovered, and walked out without turning around. Behind her, she heard a sound, brief, low. It might have been a laugh. She wasn't sure. She'd never heard Rémi Fontaine laugh before. Neither, she would later learn, had anyone else. To Tumperlum. The job offer came on a Thursday. Not a catering contract, a personal one. Rémi Fontaine required a private household coordinator, someone to manage the administrative operations of his Westmount residence, his calendar, his correspondence with vendors, contractors, and the various personal affairs that his main office couldn't or wouldn't handle. The position had been vacant for 6 weeks. The previous coordinator had resigned. Before her, there had been 3 others in 8 months. The staffing agency that called Colette was very clear about the compensation. It was more than she made in 4 months at the auberge. She should have asked more questions. She asked about parking. Her first week was, in retrospect, an education in how completely she had misread the situation. The Westmount house was not a house. It was a limestone manor with a wrought iron gate and a security camera on every corner, and a man named Beau who sat in a small glass booth at the entrance and had the energy of someone who had seen things. Beau nodded at her the first morning and said nothing. She said good morning twice, cheerfully, before she understood that he was not going to respond, and that this was simply going to be how things were. The house itself was immaculate and cold in a specific way of places that are cleaned constantly but not lived in warmly. Everything was expensive, and everything was in its place. And Colette, who had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Verdun with a radiator that made opinions about the weather, felt the particular discomfort of a person who is used to rooms that are too small for the stuff in them suddenly placed inside a room that is too large for anything at all. Her office was a small room off the main hallway. Tidy desk, a computer, a phone with too many lines, a filing system she understood immediately was wrong. The filing system bothered her more than the security cameras. She spent the first 3 days reorganizing it, not because anyone asked her to, because she could see, with the specific clarity of someone who had once balanced the books for her mother's failing alterations shop and caught a billing error that saved them $800, that the system had been set up by someone who understood neither chronology nor logic. Invoices were filed under vendor names instead of dates. Recurring payments were buried in miscellaneous folders. There was a recurring charge from a refrigeration company in Laval that had been billed at the wrong rate for 11 months and nobody had caught it. She flanged it in a note and left it on the desk. She didn't expect Rémi to be the one who found it. He appeared in the doorway of her office on the 4th day at 7 in the evening, still in his suit jacket, holding the note she'd written. She had been entering data and had not heard him coming, and made a sound that she would describe later as not quite a scream, but in the same family. The Laval charge, he said. Yes. She pressed a hand to her chest. You're very quiet when you walk. It's been wrong for 11 months. 14, actually. I went back further. The error started in February of last year. She turned the monitor toward him and showed him the spreadsheet. If you want, I can draft a formal dispute. The overcharge is just under $9,000. They'll likely settle without argument because the paper trail is clear, and they know it. He looked at the spreadsheet, then at her. Do it, he said. He was gone before she could respond. By the end of the first week, the betting pool among the household staff. Colette found out about it later, from Adelaide, the housekeeper, who told her with the matter-of-fact energy of someone reporting the weather, had reached $1,200. The consensus was that she would quit by day 10. She was too cheerful, too clumsy. too round and soft and obviously out of place in Rémi Fontaine's precisely ordered world. Instead, she spilled an entire pot of soup on herself in the kitchen on day 8, said, "Oh, for the love of poutine," with such genuine exhaustion that the cook, a small, fierce woman named Marguerite who had not smiled at anyone in 4 years, laughed so hard she had to sit down. Colette became, through absolutely no strategic intent of her own, the first person in the Fontaine household that the staff actually liked. De Tumperlum. She noticed things because that was simply how her brain worked. She noticed that Rémi drank his coffee black but always took 1 extra sugar on days when he'd been on the phone with people in Vancouver. She noticed that the grey folder on the bottom left of his desk, the one that was never left out when visitors arrived, contained documents that looked like shipping manifests, but with column headers in a different order than any shipping manifest she'd ever processed at the Auberge's supplier intake. She noticed that Beau, at the gate, sometimes spoke quietly into his radio at exactly 10:45 in the morning, and the disc coincided with the arrival of a black car with tinted windows that never appeared in any of the visitor logs she maintained. She noticed all of this and filed it away in the part of her brain where she put things she wasn't ready to look at directly. It was easier, she told herself, to focus on the job she was actually doing. The job she was actually doing had a $6,000 refrigeration refund, a completely restructured vendor contact system, and a calendar so efficiently maintained that Rémi's personal lawyer had called to ask who was responsible, because he'd been trying to get a coherent schedule out of that office for 2 years. On a Tuesday in her 3rd week, Rémi came home early from a meeting. He found Colette on her hands and knees in the main hallway, surrounded by the scattered contents of an archival box that had slipped from her arms and exploded across the floor. There were folders everywhere. A sheaf of papers had somehow ended up draped over the umbrella stand. One had made it under the antique console table. She was methodically gathering them, sorting as she went, muttering quietly to herself. "I was going to the storage room," she said without looking up because she'd heard his footsteps. The box was heavier than it looked. "I have it under control. You have papers under my furniture. I have papers under your furniture, and I'm retrieving them in chronological order, which is more than could be said for how they were stored before." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Your 9 o'clock tomorrow has been rescheduled. The flooring contractor called, and the limestone sample you ordered is delayed. Also, there's a casserole in the oven because Marguerite's granddaughter was sick and she had to leave at 3 and I didn't want dinner to be. Are you okay? You look like you've had a bad one." He stood in the hallway in his coat, looking at her on the floor surrounded by papers, and something in his face did something she couldn't name. "The flooring contractor," he said finally. "I put him off until Thursday. I told him you had an unmovable prior commitment." "Did I?" "You do now." She turned back to the papers. "The casseroles, chicken, and root vegetables. There's enough for 2 if you haven't eaten." He ate. She didn't stay. She wasn't going to presume. But she'd left it plated and covered. And when she came in the next morning, the dish was clean and on the counter, and there was a text on her phone from an unknown number that said simply, "The casserole was good." She saved the number under RF and told herself that was as far as this was going. De Tumperlum. She found out what she'd been trying not to find out on a Wednesday afternoon in her 5th week. And it happened the way a lot of things happened around Colette Tremblay, accidentally, completely, and at the worst possible moment. She had gone into the East Wing study to leave a signed contract on the desk. The door was ajar. She pushed it open without knocking, which she immediately understood was a mistake because there were 4 men in the room besides Rémi, and they were not having a meeting about logistics. One of them was holding a photograph. Another had a map spread across the reading table with locations circled in red marker. The conversation stopped the moment she appeared. Every set of eyes in the room turned toward her. Colette looked at the map, at the photograph, at the 4 men who had the particular stillness of people who did not like unexpected guests. "I have the Belanger contract," she said, holding up the folder. "Signed and dated. I'll leave it on the side table." She walked to the side table, set the folder down with great precision, turned around, walked out. closed the door behind her with a soft, deliberate click. She made it back to her office, sat down in her chair, looked at her computer screen. She knew what she'd seen. She wasn't naive. She'd grown up in Verdun. She knew what certain kinds of meetings looked like. The newspaper article about the port investigation was sitting in a perfectly clear spot in her memory. The grey folder on his desk. The black car at 10:45. She should leave. She knew she should leave. She opened the Belange file on her computer and finished cross-referencing the payment schedule because it was due to the accountant by 4 o'clock, and the accountant was very punctual, and she wasn't going to blow a deadline because of an existential crisis. Rémi appeared in her doorway at 4:15. She kept typing. Most people, he said, would have a larger reaction to what you walked into. Most people don't have a filing deadline at 4. She hit send on the email. Then she stopped typing and turned to face him. I grew up across the street from a man named Gilles Fortier. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what he was. He shoveled our walk every winter without being asked. And he was at my mother's funeral, and he never once made us feel like we owed him anything. She looked at Rémi steadily. I'm not going to pretend I don't understand what's happening here. I'm also not going to pretend I'm not good at this job. So if you're going to let me go, do it now so I can call the agency before they close. Rémi leaned against the doorframe and looked at her for a long time. The Belange contract, he said. Was there an issue with Clause 7? She blinked. Clause 7 is fine. Clause 9 has an ambiguity in the liability language that I flagged for your lawyer 2 days ago. Noted. He straightened. Be here tomorrow. He left. She sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she turned back to her computer and started on the next item in her inbox. To Tumperlum. The warmth crept in sideways the way it always does. She noticed that Rémi started leaving the door of his study open when she was the only other person in the house. She noticed that he asked her opinion, once on a completely mundane question about whether the dining table should stay by the window in winter, and then that he actually rearranged the table. She noticed that the staff started looking at her differently, not with suspicion or the polite blankness they'd offered at first, but with the specific deference usually reserved for someone in a different category entirely. Adelaide told her, very quietly one afternoon, that in 4 years she had never seen Rémi eat a meal in the kitchen. That was where he and Colette had started having dinner on the night she worked late, informally, standing at the counter, because Colette had started keeping the leftovers in labeled containers, and at some point he had simply started eating them with her. She told herself it was circumstantial. She was good at her job, and he respected competence. That was all it was. She told herself this while she was retrieving a set of keys from the high cabinet above the coat closet, standing on her toes on the second rung of a small stepladder, reaching too far and feeling the ladder lurch with the particular commitment of something that has decided this is its moment. She grabbed the cabinet door. The cabinet doors swung open. A decorative ceramic bowl on the top shelf tipped forward. She caught the bowl with one hand, the keys with the other, and the ladder finished its fall without her on it, because she'd already grabbed the cabinet with enough force to jam her elbow into the wall. She stood there, bowl in one hand, keys in the other, elbow throbbing, ladder on the floor. I'm fine, she said to no one. You're bleeding, said Rémi from directly behind her. She turned. He was standing 3 feet away. She had not heard him come in. It's a scrape, she said, the elbow, it's fine. He crossed the distance between them, took the ball from her hand and set it on the counter, and then, before she processed that this was happening, took her elbow very gently in both hands and examined the scrape with the focused attention of a man who was used to assessing damage. It's a scrape, she said again, slightly less confidently. I know. He didn't let go. He turned her arm slightly toward the light. His hands were warm. She was very aware of how large they were. You caught the bowl. Habit. Things break when I drop them. He looked up at her then. Standing this close, she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes. He didn't look like a man who smiled much, but she could see where the smiles had been, once. Long ago, maybe. Or recently, in private. He let go of her arm, stepped back. got the first aid kit from the cabinet below the sink because apparently he knew exactly where it was, and handed it to her without ceremony. "Try not to bleed on the flooring," he said. The installer finally confirmed Thursday. He walked out. She stood in the hallway with the first aid kit and a feeling in her chest that she absolutely could not afford to have. De Tumperlum. The threat arrived on a Friday. Colette had stayed late, not unusual, working through a backlog of correspondence that had piled up during a week when Rémi had been in meetings every day and unavailable to approve anything. She was locking up the filing cabinet when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. A photo. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at, and then she understood all at once. It was her. Walking to the corner store 3 blocks from her apartment in Verdun, taken from a car. The timestamp was from 2 days ago. The message below it read, "Tell Fontaine to back off the Beauport deal, or you'll have an accident. You look like the type who has those." She sat down in her chair. Her hands were shaking. She thought about not telling him. She thought about this seriously for about 4 minutes, which was how long it took her to remember that she was not actually someone who was built for keeping things like this to herself, and also that whoever had taken that photo knew where she lived. She walked down the hall and knocked on the closed study door. "Come." She went in. He was at his desk, papers spread, reading glasses that she had never once seen him wear in front of anyone else, which she noted and filed away. She put her phone on the desk in front of him, photo visible. He looked at it. He took his glasses off. He looked at it again. "When did this arrive?" His voice was very quiet. 20 minutes ago. "And you came directly to me." "I don't know what else to do with it." He stood up. He picked up her phone and looked at the photo for a long time. Then he set it down and looked at her, and his face had done the thing she'd seen it do once before. In the study, when the 4 men had been there. That total, absolute stillness that was not calm, but was something that lived just next to it. "You're not going back to Verdun tonight," he said. "I have my cat. I'll have someone collect your cat." That feels like an escalation. "Colette." He said her name and she stopped. "Someone has been watching you. They've communicated a specific threat. You are not returning to an unsecured location." He paused. "This is not negotiable." She looked at him. "You know what the threat is about." "Yes." "The Beauport deal." "Yes." "Are you going to tell me what that is?" A long moment. "No," he said. She nodded slowly. "Okay. My cat's name is Bissu, and he bites people he doesn't know, so whoever you send should wear long sleeves." Something crossed his face. She still wasn't sure if it was a smile. It was gone too fast. He made a call. 2 calls. The quiet, efficient machinery of whatever it was he actually ran shifted into a different gear, and Colette sat in the chair across from his desk and watched it happen, and thought about how her mother would feel about all of this. And then she thought about the photo of herself on the sidewalk, and she was frightened, genuinely, for the first time since this all started. Rémi caught her expression. "No one is going to touch you," he said. "No preamble, no qualifier. Just the flat declaration of someone who had never once said something he didn't mean." She believed him. That was the part that surprised her. De Tumperlum. They found out who had taken the photo on Saturday. His name was not given to Colette. What she was told by Beau, who had apparently been assigned to brief her, was that the situation had been resolved and the individual involved had been strongly encouraged to pursue interests in other cities. Beau said this with the effect of someone reading a traffic report. Colette was in the kitchen eating toast when Rémi came back. It was early morning and she was in her borrowed room on the 3rd floor in borrowed pajamas because she hadn't packed anything, and the guest room had been stocked with things for her by Adelaide, who had done it with such efficient care that Colette had almost cried, which she blamed on the stress and the fact that it was nearly midnight. He came through the back entrance. His shirt had been replaced. She noticed this. "Resolved?" she said. "Resolved." He poured himself a glass of water, stood at the counter and drank it. "You look terrible," she said. "Thank you." I mean, you look like you've been somewhere unpleasant. I have. She pushed the toast toward him. He looked at it. He sat down across from her and ate a piece of toast at 7 in the morning in his kitchen, with his shirt slightly wrong buttoned on the left side, and Colette looked at this man. This very dangerous, very complicated, very tired man, and felt the thing in her chest that she'd been trying not to feel for weeks settle into place like it had decided it wasn't going anywhere. I'm going to stay, she said. He looked up. In the job, I'm going to stay. She wrapped both hands around her mug. I know what you are. I'm not pretending about it. And I know that makes me, I don't know what it makes me, but I'm good at this job and you know I am. And whatever else is true, you have never once made me feel like a liability. In my whole life, people have looked at me and seen a liability. She met his eyes. You don't look at me like that. He was quiet for a long moment. I look at you, he said carefully, like someone who catches the bowl and bleeds on the doorframe and notices a $9,000 billing error that 4 professional accountants missed. He set down the toast. I look at you like the only person in this house who tells me things as they actually are. She swallowed. That's a very practical way to describe how you look at someone. I'm a practical man. You moved the dining table away from the window because I mentioned it gets cold on that side in November. He had nothing to say to that. She stood up to take her plate to the sink and, because she was who she was, caught her hip on the corner of the kitchen island, stumbled sideways, grabbed the edge of the counter, and stopped herself. The mug stayed upright. She considered this a personal victory. She turned around. Rémi had stood up. He was 2 steps away. He hadn't moved to catch her. There hadn't been time, but he had moved, which meant he had been going to. I'm fine, she said. I know, he said. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear with a carefulness that was wildly disproportionate to the gesture, like he was doing something fragile. You always are. She looked up at him. Rémi, she said. It was the first time she'd used his name directly. She watched it register in his face. He kissed her, not tentatively, not as a question. He kissed her the way he did everything, with complete intention and no wasted movement, and Colette grabbed the front of his unfortunately buttoned shirt with both hands and kissed him back. And it tasted like coffee and exhaustion and something she didn't have a word for yet. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. His hands were at her waist, warm through the borrowed pajama fabric, completely unhurried. You're not a liability, he said quietly. You have never been a liability. She laughed, a little unevenly. I've spilled things on you. I've knocked over your furniture. I pulled your cabinet off the wall. You recovered a $9,000 billing error, reorganized a filing system that has been useless for 3 years, made Marguerite laugh for the first time since her husband died, and told 4 armed men in my study that you had a filing deadline. He pulled back slightly to look at her face. Colette, you walked into the most dangerous room in this house and asked if I'd eaten. She blinked. The casserole. The casserole? She started to laugh. It came out a little ragged. All the stress and the fear and the 7 weeks of trying very hard to be professional, finally finding somewhere to go. He watched her laugh with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something open and ungoverned. And she understood that nobody saw this, that nobody in his world saw Rémi Fontaine look like this, and that this was not a small thing he was handing her. I have a cat named Bissou who bites people, she said, once she'd caught her breath. I know. He bit Beau. Beau deserved it a little. Yes, Rémi agreed. He did. Outside, the November light was coming up pale and cold over Westmount. Inside, the kitchen was warm, and Marguerite would arrive in an hour and pretend she hadn't noticed anything. And Beau would write his morning report and leave out the parts that weren't his business. And the household would continue to run with the precision that Colette had quietly, stubbornly, accidentally built into it. She was still holding his shirt. He made no move to step back. I want a raise, she said. You'll get one. And Bissou needs a room on the ground floor. He doesn't do stairs. Done. And I'm fixing the Clause 9 language in the Baylanger contract myself, because your lawyer keeps using the passive voice. Rémi looked at her. The almost smile was doing something more complicated now. Colette Tremblay, he said, you came here to coordinate a filing system. I did, she agreed. And now you're negotiating. I'm very good at my job, she said simply. He kissed her again, which was not, technically, a counter-argument. She decided it counted as a yes. I've thought about Colette Tremblay a lot since finishing this story. Not because she's extraordinary in the ways we're taught to admire. She's not fearless, she's not polished, she trips over her own feet in borrowed heels on freshly waxed floors. But she has something that I think is genuinely rare, and I keep coming back to what it actually is. There's a moment early on where she spills coffee on the most dangerous man in Montreal, and her first instinct is to apologize and offer a payment plan. She's terrified. She knows she's terrified. She knows she does the next right thing anyway. That's not bravery the way movies sell it. That's something quieter and harder. That's a person who has decided, somewhere along the line, that being honest about who she is matters more than performing a version of herself that other people find easier to deal with. She walks into Rémi Fontaine's world without pretending to be smaller than she is, either in body or in character. That kind of integrity, the daily, unglamorous kind, is what I think actually moves things. And then there's her mind. She notices the billing error nobody else caught. She reorganizes a system 3 years in the making because it offends her sense of logic. She flanks the Clause 9 language because passive voice in a liability section is genuinely a problem. None of this comes from ambition or performance. It comes from paying attention. I think we underestimate how rare that is. A person who actually looks at what's in front of them and thinks carefully about what it means, without needing credit for it. Colette's intelligence isn't the flashy kind. It's the kind that just quietly makes everything around it work better. But what gets me most is her persistence. She finds out, clearly and undeniably, what Rémi's world actually is. She sits with it. She finishes her filing deadline. She comes back the next morning. That's not naivety. She grew up in Verdun. She knows exactly what she's seeing. That's a person who has decided that the life she's building is worth showing up for even when it's uncomfortable and complicated and a little frightening. When Frankie's people photograph her on her own street and threaten her, she doesn't collapse. She goes straight to Rémi and tells him the truth. She doesn't perform courage. She just keeps doing the next thing. What I take from her story is that these 3 things, the integrity to be genuinely yourself, the sharpness to actually pay attention, and the will to keep going when it would be easier not to, they compound. They build on each other. Colette doesn't get the raise and the cat room, and Rémi Fontaine looking at her like she's the only real thing in a room full of ghosts, because she was lucky or because life rewarded her suffering. She gets it because she consistently showed up as exactly who she was, did the work in front of her with real care, and refused to quit when the situation got complicated. That's a kind of cause and effect I believe in. Not fate, not luck. Just a person being genuinely themselves over and over again, until the world around them has no choice but to respond.